I was ordained on the 22nd of July in 1956, and 2 weeks after that, a good friend of our family, a priest, was appointed to the church at St. Joseph's parish in a town, a mining community called Pontefract. If you're good at place names, you know that Pontefract was originally a Roman settlement in England because it means the broken bridge. And he was appointed to this parish where there had just been 3 priests, and now he was going to be reduced to 1 assistant and himself, and the assistant was away on vacation. So he went to the bishop and said that he knew that I'd been ordained and that I was going later on to the university, and in the meantime, would it be all right if he asked me to go to the parish? Yes, says the bishop, you ask him, and if he says no, I'll appoint him. Well, fortunately, we didn't get to that because I said yes, I'd come. And within a day or 2 of being in that parish, I was summoned to a particular house where there was a boy. He was age 7 because he had made his first communion in May before I was ordained. And he was extremely ill and suffering from an external cancer. The cancer was in his ear. And he was in very great suffering and considerable distress, and particularly in the medical knowledge of those days, it was a hopeless situation. He was not going to recover. And not long before I had arrived in the parish, his mother had gone into his room, into his bedroom, and she was pretty well overwhelmed by all the situation and the hopelessness of it, and she looked very sad. And he said to her that he didn't want her to look sad, that he liked her to look happy. So from that day onwards, which was before I arrived, until the day the boy died, which was almost a year, she never went into his room unless she was smiling. What made it particularly difficult was that soon after my arrival in the parish, she had also gone to the doctor and she was told that she had cancer. And she didn't tell the family, and she certainly didn't tell the boy, but she smiled for all those 10 months every time she went near him, because that's what he wanted. That sign, that smile, was the sign of her courageousness, living courageously. It gave hope to the boy that life was good. In the legends of the Roman martyrs are commemorated in our first Eucharistic prayer. Before the consecration, we have the list of some of the apostles and then all the early popes. And in the list which comes just after the commemoration of the dead, towards the end of the Eucharistic prayer, we have some of the very famous Roman martyrs, among whom were 2 women, Perpetua and Felicity. Now, Perpetua, they had both become Christian. Perpetua was a wealthy person, and Felicity was her personal maid. Probably a slave, which was common in those days, and maybe a slave that had been given freedom, but was not yet totally free. In any case, Felicity was pregnant when they were arrested, and they were thrown in prison. And while they were in prison, it came to the time where Felicity was to deliver, and there were no special arrangements made for it. She was just lying there, writhing on the floor, and the guard was laughing at her and saying, if you are screaming out to your God now that you're going to deliver a baby, what will it be like when you stand in front of the lions? And she said, at the moment, I'm on my own, and I've got to get through this with the help of God. But when I'm out there, He is in control. And when it came to the moment when they were put to the lions, she went out with great confidence, great peacefulness. That was the sign of her courage. So those two pillars, joy and peacefulness, are the signs of living courageously. The Bible tells us a great deal about living courageously. The book of Exodus tells us at least of one man who is courageous against all the odds, and that's Moses. And the people of God being completely the opposite, forever complaining, forever objecting, forever wondering why, and never accepting anything graciously. But then the story goes on. We get the book of Judges. And people are raised up by God, just ordinary people. People who just came from very simple circumstances. They're suddenly raised up to defend their people. Gideon, who was a bit untrustful of God, he wanted very clear signs, not just once, but twice. And then there was Deborah, who gave us a song, the Canticle of Deborah. And then there was Samson, gifted with great strength. Unfortunately, with his strength came an awful lot of testosterone. Testosterone, I'm sorry. And that was his downfall. Now then, they had difficulties to face. They had enemies and neighbors who stole their crops and killed their cattle and destroyed their homes, and that's what they had to defend them against. What we are called upon to deal with is something different. A lack of prayer in school. The desire to move the phrase, "In God we trust." The whole challenge to the question of life in our world. Like the judges, we have to face those issues courageously, with joy in our hearts and peace within. Not aggressively, not in anger, but in peace. It's only if we do it in peace that we will ever succeed. There's the whole question of integrity in life these days. You cannot have avoided all the publicity and all the campaigning that is going on at the present moment. If you're not aware of it, then you must have buried your head in the sand. But there's very little integrity in what is being said as a positive suggestion or in a comment about an opponent. Integrity is hard to live by, but it means that you are a whole person. These days, compromise is the word that is used. In England, they passed an act recently in Parliament, an Equality Act. We are not equal. We have equal rights before the law, and we are equally open to God's love. But God's love for each of us individually is not equal. It's how much we recognize our need to begin with. But the Blessed Mother was blessed way beyond the level that we will be blessed. But we're blessed more than enough. But we're not equal. So they passed an Equality Act, which of course granted equality to whatever your sexual preference. And therefore they said that any adoption agency, and the same thing is coming to America, that any adoption agency that accepts public money must offer adoption to people independently of their sexual orientation. And so many of the Catholic adoption societies simply closed their doors. The one in my own diocese fought an action in the High Court and won, and now they have to fight another battle against the Charity Commission. And they may succeed, as compromise may be made. But that is not the way to live. We don't live by compromise. Jesus didn't say, compromise yourself to your neighbor. He said something much harder, love your neighbor. As we go through the scripture, you come across a man called Jeremiah. Jeremiah is often considered to be a rather miserable person, a person that you would not expect to see a smile on his face. He certainly was a man who suffered a great deal of adversity in his life. There's that wonderful chapter in Jeremiah chapter 20, where he turns to God with anger in his face and says, "You have deceived me." God didn't deceive him, but the people rejected what he had said, and so God's words were not fulfilled. He was imprisoned by the authorities, and yet he was always with the people. And when they were in exile in Babylon, and this is chapter 29, he wrote them a wonderful letter. If you like to look it up, chapter 29 of the prophecy of Jeremiah, he wrote them a wonderful letter which was to guide their life while they were in Babylon. And it's not chapter 29, I'm very sorry. Well, that's what I wrote down. Oh yes, that's right, the letter to the people in exile. The Lord God of Israel says this to all the exiles deported from Jerusalem to Babylon: build houses, settle down, plant gardens, eat what they produce, marry and have sons and daughters, choose wives for your sons, find husbands for your daughters, so that they can bear sons and daughters in their turn, and they must increase there and not decrease, because God's people must continue whatever the adversity. We are called to live courageously. At this time of the year, in the Jewish community, they are preparing to celebrate Hanukkah, and the books of the Old Testament which deal most completely with Hanukkah are the books of Maccabees. We have long incorrectly considered them books of history. They are not books of history, no more than the Gospels are books of history. They are apocalypses. Two apocalypses put together as two separate books, but both from different aspects. One is the long-suffering aspect, the persecuted people who will simply not bow to the demands which are made by the pagan authorities. They will not turn their back on God. The story of the woman whose 7 sons are all of them taken, and the sons, one by one, are given the choice of worshipping the pagan gods and turning away from the Lord God, or they are going to be tortured and put to death. And in front of their mother's eyes, they are tortured and put to death, 1, 2, 3, 4, right down to the last. And then she herself is put to death. You must not compromise with evil. That's the story of one of the books of Maccabee. The other book gives the opposite aspect. It's the story of Judas Maccabeus and his successors, and how they actively opposed. They formed an army. They fought against the Seleucids, as we call them from the historical point of view. They fought against the enemy, and they overcame them, and they liberated Jerusalem, and they found the temple desecrated, but they rebuilt the altar of the temple, and they could give faithful worship to God. Two ways of dealing with life, depending upon the circumstances, but in either case, no compromise. So in the story of the battles of Judas Maccabeus, there is the account of one particular battle where a number of the Jewish army were slaughtered, and as they were examined at the end of the battle, they found that on the inside of their coats they had pinned an emblem of a pagan god. As it were, they were hedging their bets. And the book of Maccabees said they were killed because they compromised. So we live with a smile. We live in peace, not in anger, and we avoid compromising. In the canonization process of the Catholic Church, of course, it wasn't always part of the process, but it has been for a large number of ceremonies. There is a phrase which I translate very loosely. It says that the person dealt heroically with the drudgery of the day. In other words, it accepts that there's drudgery and misery and repetition in everybody's life. We don't live terribly exciting lives. But the saint is the person who deals heroically with that ordinariness and overcomes. No compromise, but a smile and at peace. When as a youth I read the autobiography of Saint Teresa of Lisieux, and she describes in one instance how when she was a novice, there was another novice with her, and as novices are wont to be, they were put to scrubbing the floors. And this other girl was a little bit clumsy, and when she put the scrubbing brush into the bucket, she didn't just put it there, she plunged it there, and all the dirty soap spatters came across her St. Teresa's habit, and she knew that she'd have to go and change, and that meant another day in the laundry, and so on and so on. And I thought, that's how trivial that is. That was my view at the time. But it's not trivial, because it's that sort of irritation that we can so easily allow to cause a great reaction, to call forth a great reaction from us. And it's when we can deal with that peacefully that we are really showing great heroicness. And St. Paul, in the letter to the Ephesians, in chapter 6, and a little bit of it was used in one of the prophecies from this morning, he tells us that we're not just dealing with soap suds that are being scattered by a clumsy person, that our battle is really very much greater. This is chapter 6 of the Ephesians, verse 12. For it is not against human enemies that we have to struggle, but against principalities and powers who are masters of the darkness of this world, the spirits of evil in the heavens. That is why you must take up all God's armor, or you will not be able to put up any resistance on the evil days, or stand your ground, even though you exert yourself to the full. So he's under no difficulty, he's under no misunderstanding that we are facing difficulties all day long. The person who seems to skate through the day as if there were no difficulties is the person who's got the art of living. There are difficulties there. They've learned to see them in perspective. That is the word, to see them in perspective. The rule of St. Benedict says that when we come across a difficulty and you don't know how to overcome it, that you need to look at it, because he wrote in Latin, sub specie eternitatis. You look at it in the light of eternity, the virtue of hope. You look at it in the light of eternity. We have to make the ultimate objective of our life shed its light upon each day, especially upon the difficulties which we encounter in the course of these days. That is why we need those two ingredients in our life, joy and peacefulness. Joy will make us light-hearted in dealing with a situation. Peacefulness will communicate itself to everyone, and they'll see us as the person who skates through the difficulties of life. Most human situations do not give evidence of that attitude. Wherever you go, where you meet a group of people and they're simply passing time together, they're talking, they're discussing things, inevitably there will be complaints. Inevitably, authority will be criticized. And inevitably, there will be gossip. On Saturday afternoons, as priests administer the sacrament of reconciliation, almost 90% of people admit to being involved in gossip. And you might say it's so ordinary that it doesn't bother us very much. Change the word. Call it character assassination, and we might become a little bit more conscious of it. But all those three things, our complaints, our criticisms, and our gossip, are all based upon a pride that is blown beyond reasonable levels. We complain because we think we're too good for that situation. We attack authority because we would rather like to be the ones in authority. And we gossip about others because pushing them down enables us to feel better. It is all so terribly, terribly selfish. Not at all what St. Paul said to the Philippians, that we must empty ourselves to put on the mind of Christ, to empty ourselves as he emptied himself in order to bring life to the world. It isn't adequate merely to smile during a conversation which is character assassination. It isn't adequate merely to stand there and just let it wash over you as if it had never been said. It is necessary to redress the balance, to put in the positive statement about the person who is being assassinated. I probably have told you the story before, at least to some of you, of one of the commentaries in the Muslim community on the Quran. And it tells of the time when Jesus was a young boy, and he went out with his friends, and they came across a dog, a dead dog, in the dust of the street. And one of the friends sort of kicked the dog and could see a lot of blood around its mouth. And he said, "Wow, this is a wild dog, look at the blood." And the other one rubbed his foot over the hair of the dog and said, this is a very uncared for dog, its hair is all matted. And another one said, "It's a very hungry dog, look at the ribs." And Jesus said, "Doesn't it have white teeth?" There's always something that you can say to dredge from the depths bad conversation and make it something uplifting. And if you give people who are dragging somebody apart, if you give them something else to think about, it may be that they'll stop being destructive and begin to see that person in a different light. And it applies to us if we are to live courageously. Our minds are made to judge. That's the only, apart from absorbing information, that's the only thing that your mind can do. Make a judgment about the information that is in front of you. You cannot do anything else except make a judgment. But you can focus upon what you don't like, and so your judgment is a criticism. Or you can focus on what you do like, what impresses you, and you can give praise. We are called to give praise, to see the good wherever it is, not to stress the evil that is there, but to see the good and to praise it. And in the light of what is good, what is not so good will fail. And so if we are consistent in putting forward what is good, then we will begin to counteract the destructive quality of gossip. The powerhouse for all this is prayer. It is prayer which enables us to live courageously. Nothing else. Our prayer will enable us to live courageously. We were brought up, as young children are necessarily brought up, to say prayers. But there comes in the course of maturity a greater value than saying prayers. Cardinal Hume of England, as again many of you will remember my saying before, called prayer wasting time with God. Wasting time with God. There is no end product. There is no addition to the balance sheet. There is no new achievement. All those things are the things that the world looks for. But wasting time with God enables you to be a courageous person in the circumstances of your lives. Now, we are the best possible individuals for persuading ourselves that we cannot give any time to pray. I gave a retreat to the DREs of the diocese earlier this summer, and I was suggesting to them that their work as DREs, the efficacy of their program, was not on the skill that they had or the knowledge that they had, but the amount of time they spent in prayer. And afterwards, nobody threw any soft tomatoes at me during the talk, but afterwards one lady did come up to me, and she looked very young. She didn't look more than about 20, but she must, I think, have been a little older than that, because she told me that she got 5 children. And that it was utterly impossible for her to find 5 minutes in the day to spend in silence. That it was utterly impossible. Well, I didn't argue. There's no point in arguing. That merely convinces us that we are right. But if she was told that she had cancer, she'd find more than 5 minutes a day to go to the hospital. And if there was something that was particularly important to do, like going to a retreat for the DREs, she could easily find 2 days. Well, not easily, but she could find 2 days. If we want to, we can find 5 minutes. It may get us out of bed 5 minutes earlier in the morning. And I would not suggest that you go to bed 5 minutes later at night, because that would simply mean that you'd fall straight to sleep. But 5 minutes earlier in the morning may give you a chance of 5 minutes with God, wasting time with God, in silence and in peace. You see, the courage to do that, and this is the virtue of hope, the courage it requires is to take a little bite today, 5 minutes, so that in 20 or 30 years' time, you may be able to have 30 minutes. That is how living courageously contributes to the virtue of hope. We live in the expectation that as circumstances ease, so there is more time for what is necessary in life. Prayer requires silence, because prayer is the purpose of prayer is to enter into communion with the Lord Jesus, but what it does in us is change our attitudes. It doesn't give us things. It doesn't give us achievement. It doesn't make us more ready for some task that we've got to do, other than by changing our attitude so that we can see priorities in a different light, so that we can see the way that we do things in a different light, so that we may be able to smile and live at peace. Courage is required in prayer because most of the time nothing seems to happen. But you have to go on. You have to keep giving the time. You have to try. And that during that apparently useless time, there are other things which will compete for the time that you're giving to prayer. And they're very strong competitors. Help to other people, help to your family. Now perhaps that your family have left home, but they are now having their families and they want help and they need advice and they need a little bit of relief, etc. There are always things that will compete. There are always things that you can say, it would be better if. And it takes courage to say, no, this is for God. And whatever happens, I'm giving it to God. And above all, there is the great difficulty of the complaints that we get from other people because we are wasting time with God. But it is the best time that we have. You remember a little while ago, the news media told us, with great joy in their hearts, that Mother Teresa lived with severe doubts for the last years of her life. Well, of course, that was their interpretation. I don't think she lived with doubts. I think she was in that period of time which St. John of the Cross calls the dark night of the spirit, where there is nothing really there that gives you a sense of certainty. that there is nothing that you can hang on to and say, this will get me through. There's no magic pill. There's no magic activity. There's just an awful lot of darkness, not uncertainty, but unknowing. You simply do not know anything. And in the writings of St. John of the Cross, the dark night of the Spirit is towards the end of the perfecting of the human person, so that they are now ready for that wonderful gift of embrace with God. And I am sure that Mother Teresa went through those many years of sheer darkness and unknowing, of great uncertainty, because she was so close to the gift of God of living in his embrace. I think that really is what we should consider purgatory to be. That moment of refining of the human person. That moment of that process of detaching us from hanging on to all the things of this world that we feel that we can't live without. And there are many of them in everybody's life. It's to live in that darkness, which is the courage of living correctly. And living correctly is the practice of the virtue of hope. Mother Teresa was buoyed by hope when she could feel nothing, knew nothing, and had no certainties. But it was a moment of wonderful purification. And no doubt, when she died, she went straight into the arms of the Father. It didn't stop her from doing her daily work. But that hour that she spent with the sisters every morning in prayer was an hour of great agony to her. But she had the courage to go through it, to appear afterwards, to deal with people who were desperately sick, with a smile on her face and a demeanor which just exuded the peacefulness which was in her soul. Now that is living courageously. And that is how the virtue of hope brings us to the Father. You will not find it spoken about in any literature which deals from a worldly point of view. It's not in the training program of accountants. It's not part of the process by which a lawyer becomes a lawyer. You don't learn it in medical school. You can learn about it in books of spirituality, but you can only begin to practice it if you give time each day to silence in prayer. And it's in that silence that your courage is refined and that your strength is built. And hope becomes the living reality of a person who can smile and live at peace. Thank you.